I didn't tell you, I just went to the Fidel Castro School of Speech-Making stuff. Yeah, well, the guy who introduced Lincoln for his Gettysburg Address spoke for more than an hour. Okay. All right, I think we're okay. Making it work. Alrighty, I think we're going to get going. So I'd like to welcome everyone here to this presentation of the Northcutt Lecture. Yes. This is an annual event that's put on for the public and the people who attend the General Assembly of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Ruth Northcutt was an outstanding member of our society in kind of the middle of the 20th century, who just she passed away about 50 years ago this year. I actually am old enough that I actually met her at one of these meetings back then. Now, my name is Chris Gaynor. I have the honor of being the president of the RASC, and I also ply my trade as a space flight historian these days. Today we've had a couple of outstanding presentations relating to the 50th anniversary of the historic flight of Apollo 11 to the moon, and one by Randy Atwood, our executive director. I was going to give one, but I don't need to give one because I have an article in the Sky News which talks about my area of expertise, which is Canada's contributions to the Apollo program and to Apollo 11. So I'll just invite you to take a look at that when you have the chance. And Sky News is an excellent magazine in any case. I think I'll just get to the cut to the chase and introduce our main speaker tonight, Dr. James Hansen, Jim Hansen. Now, of course, he's best known today as the author of First Man, the biography of Neil Armstrong, which recently was adapted into a really fascinating movie, and I'm sure most of you have seen it. And Dr. Hansen has actually written quite a bit about the history of NASA and space flight, but NASA stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and I would say that Dr. Hansen is the expert on the first A in NASA. He has written several books about the history of aeronautical research, aerodynamics. He's written a multi-volume history of the Langley Research Center at NASA, which is where they do a lot of that research. And I think that's an important reason why he was called upon to write this book with Neil Armstrong, or about Neil Armstrong. Now, the two astronauts who flew to the moon with Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin, both wrote books on their own, but Neil Armstrong did not, but he basically agreed with Dr. Hansen to write kind of his authorized biography. I think an important reason for that is kind of part of Neil Armstrong's character. Neil Armstrong, and I'm no expert because I never met him, but I've studied him a lot. Neil Armstrong loved to fly. He liked to fly anything, I think. And so he was probably very up to date with the historical work that Dr. Hansen has done about aeronautics at NASA. And I suspect that was a big reason why he agreed to let Dr. Hansen write his biography. So Dr. Hansen in his career, he's spent a lot of his career teaching the history of technology, especially in his specialty at Auburn University in Alabama. He's actually from Indiana, I believe, and got his PhD in history from Ohio State University and then went on to Auburn. So that's a little bit of an introduction to Dr. Hansen. So I'm going to invite him up to the stage, and he will give a talk, and then later on he will be having a discussion with our own Nicole Mortellaro. So off to you.
Thank you. They've asked me to take this off. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. It's really an honor to be presenting the Northcutt Memorial Lecture and for me to be here with you. I've visited Toronto maybe more than some Americans and much less than other smarter Americans than me. This is my fourth trip to Toronto. And I think maybe the worst weather I've seen in Toronto, but I'm still enjoying my visit a great deal. I always like to get a sense of my audience. I was a university professor for nearly 32 years, and you always need to find out where the troublemakers are, in the classroom. They're usually the hands are in the back, always in the back of the room. But I want to start by just asking you a question. I want to see hands again, and I'd probably be the same ones, I think, that'll probably have their hands up. But how many of you were living on July 20th, 1969 when the moon landing took place? And most of you, the white-haired people we're pretty certain. Let's just see, how many of you were not living in July 20? So it's a substantial number. It's an audience that really isn't representative of the globe's population, honestly. I haven't done the calculation for a while, but I think it's, the last time I ran it, somewhere between 80 and 85% of the world's population today was not alive on July 20th, 1969. So that means that for most people, talking about Apollo 11 and the moon landings is like you're talking about the War of the Roses. It might as well be medieval history to a lot of the younger people. And of course, unfortunately and inevitably, time passes. There were 6 successful moon landings. And of those 6 landings, meaning there were 6 commanders, there's only 1 commander still living. And of the moonwalkers, 12 different moonwalkers, there's only 4 that are still alive today, and they range in age. I think Charlie Duke is the youngest. He was with Apollo 16. I think he's about 85. And the oldest is Buzz Aldrin, who's soon to be 90. And so hopefully they're going to be around. The survivors are going to be around for a long, long time. But every time I make that speech, in the next months, there's going to come a time we don't have any of them with us anymore. And so it's been important to have the histories told. And not, I've written obviously about an astronaut or two. But one thing that Armstrong always would urge and emphasize is that it did take over 400,000 people to do this program. And the talks we heard today, which were great talks, I learned a lot from them, from the 2 gentlemen, is that there are a lot of people that are unknown to, except for people that are really looking deeply into the history, that deserve a lot of credit, because the astronauts were just the tip of the spear. And Neil always made sure, and I think most of the other astronauts have been pretty good about this too, but Neil in particular, he wanted to make sure that these other people got their credit. This picture was taken outside of Neil's home in 2004, 15 years ago, right after we finished reviewing the final revision of my manuscript. The book was originally published in 2005. Now, I still have the same hair today, but I just slick it back more, if you believe that. But of course, this is my favorite picture. It's my only picture I asked for Neil to pose for, because I felt so fortunate to do the book with him. I had 55 hours of tape-recorded interview with him over many, many months, and I spent a lot more time with him than that. So, I tried to keep, I didn't try to become his friend, although we did become friends, I think, later and stayed in touch. But it wasn't my job to be his friend. I was supposed to write an independent, scholarly biography of the man. And that's what he wanted. That's what makes him, in my view, personal view, really exceptional as one of the astronauts, because I can't really even think of one of the other astronauts that I've met who would trust a historian, an academic, to write their life story. Most of them have done it themselves, or they've done it in conjunction with other authors, and so they've had some control over the content. Once Neil agreed, and it took about 2 years, I could give you a whole talk on how it all happened and all the challenges of getting this an agreement from him. 2 years, but after he agreed, it was my book. It was my book. He was going to answer the questions that I asked him. He was not going to direct me. He'd never said to me, Jim, you need to ask me about this, or we need to do this topic. He just answered the questions. So if I didn't know enough to ask him good questions, it would have gone by the wayside. So I had prepared, I was about 20 years into my career at this point. I had done a number of other books. Like Chris said, I had done a lot of books about aeronautics as well as space, and I think they were a factor. I'll say something specifically about that in just a minute. But Neil is still with me. He died in August of 2012, coming up on 7 years ago. He died after quadruple bypass surgery, heart surgery. I had, in a sense, become his friend by then, and I remember giving talks, being asked to give talks in tribute to Neil after his death, and the first couple I gave, I had a hard time finishing. I mean, I really just choked me up, some of the things I wanted to say about him. He was a wonderful man, complicated, a simple but complicated man. And one thing that I think I tried to do as a biographer is I tried to portray him as honestly as I could, for the most part letting him speak for himself. But you know, a biographer has to, you know, channel the evidence and put the story together. And there's some, obviously, analysis and interpretation. But so many meanings had been projected onto Neil, because Neil was kind of a sphinx-like personality. He didn't fill up, you know, he was modest, he was circumspect, he was articulate, but he was very choosy about what he articulated. And so he was the kind of the perfect, or one might say it was really not a great thing for him, but he was kind of the perfect vessel for iconography, for people to, because he became this global icon as soon as he stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969. And so because he didn't fill up his own space, it meant people could fill up his space for him. They could project into him what they wanted him to be. And a lot of what they projected was, I mean, it's all interesting, but what those projections told us, as I came to feel, they told us more about us and what we wanted from our heroes and our astronauts and our explorers, from something as epic as the moon landing. It told us more about us than it told about him. So the book was both a biography, where it was trying to get to the real Neil as well as I could, and an iconography, where I tried to understand the storytelling that has been made a part of Armstrong's legacy. I'm going to start with a story. Neil grew up in a number of small towns in Ohio. I flew over Ohio from Atlanta to get here. And I went to school at Ohio State. I grew up in northeastern Indiana, about 50 miles from the town of Wapakoneta, which is usually called Neil's hometown. But in fact, as a boy, his family lived in several different Ohio towns, because his father was an auditor. He was an accountant that worked for the state of Ohio. And his father, Stephen, this was Neil was born in 1930, so in the 30s and into the 40s, Neil's father, Stephen, was given jobs by the state of Ohio to go audit the books of a particular county. And it would take about a year to get the books done. And Stephen had grown up on a farm himself, and Ohio is largely agricultural, except for 3 or 4 big cities. And so he was sent out to county seats that were essentially rural counties. And Neil lived in a number of towns as a boy, moved around a lot until he was really high school age. And for him, he skipped the 2nd grade, because when he was moving around so much, they would evaluate him, and one of the teachers thought he didn't need to be in the 2nd grade. So he went from the 1st grade to the 3rd grade. He was such a good reader. But anyway, so he lived in a number of towns, but by the time he was ready for high school, the family had settled in Wapakoneta, which is in northwestern Ohio. Well, here's the story. When he was named the commander of Apollo 11, this was in January of 1969, and when it then became known that the commander was going to be the first one to step out onto the lunar surface, and there was some question about whether it was going to be Neil or Buzz, and I can talk about that maybe a little bit later or in our conversations. The press, as you can imagine, all over the world, certainly the American press, but really internationally, they wanted to know, well, who is this Armstrong? We knew he has been an astronaut for a while. He was commander of Gemini 8, but they wanted more. And so the media descended upon this town of Wapakoneta, which was probably 25,000. It's the county seat of Auglaize County. So it wasn't a really small town for rural Ohio, but it was a small town. And so writers descended on Wapakoneta and wanted to interview anybody that could tell them anything, any stories about Neil. You know, high school, people that went to high school with him, teachers, neighbors, anybody. If you got a Neil Armstrong story, we want to hear it. And so lots of feature stories in the spring and summer, early summer of 1969 were written about Neil and who he was, what kind of life had he lived. Well, as a historian, one of the places I went was the Armstrong Museum in Wapakoneta, which didn't have a lot of archival materials, but they did have a great collection of newspaper clippings from the era. And so I remember being down in the bowels of this museum and reading newspaper article after newspaper article. And one Wapakoneta person who got a lot of attention in these stories was a man named Jacob Zint, Z-I-N-T, Jacob Zint. Here you see his house. Jacob Zint was an engineer. He worked for Westinghouse up in Lima, Ohio, which was just up the road to the north, 10, 15 miles from Wapakoneta. He was a bachelor. And he lived in this house. It was about a block and a half from the Armstrong home in Wapakoneta. And Zint told stories to the media about how Neil, as a boy, and here you see Neil in his Boy Scout uniform. Boy Scouts were very important to Neil. A lot of the early astronauts were Boy Scouts. That Zint told the story of how Neil, when he was a boy, his Boy Scout troop came to the house because Zint, and this is my one story about astronomy and a telescope, Zint had built a homemade telescope and an observatory at the top of his home in his attic. And I have never felt the need to really talk too much about the details of the telescope until speaking to you all, and here's the best I can do. It was a homemade 8-inch reflector telescope fashioned from a stovepipe and mounted on roller skate wheels that were put up in the attic. So what happened, according to Zint, was this Boy Scout troop came to his home. He took them up the attic. He lectured to them about how he built the telescope. He gave each one a chance to look through the telescope. And at the end of the evening, there was this little blonde boy who was kind of, it was clear he wanted to ask a question. So, and of course, this was Neil Armstrong, and he came up to Mr. Zint and he asked if he could come back. And according to Mr. Zint, and there's story after story after story in the newspapers about this, that they came back and they had these long conversations about the cosmos, about the universe, about the moon. They shared theories and ideas, and that Mr. Zint even told a reporter on the eve of the launch that Neil had sent him a message through a third party that when Neil got to the moon, he was going to test some of the theories that he and Zint had come up with. Well, this was a fascinating story, and I can tell you that it had made it into every children's book about Neil that had been published up to that time, and into some of the adult books as well. This was a really important story about young Neil Armstrong growing up, fascinated with what he was seeing in this telescope and these conversations with Mr. Zint. So in my conversations with Neil, and I took them chronologically, I started with Neil's family life and background and boyhood and took it that way. So I didn't talk to him about the moon for about 30 hours, which was, incredibly fortunate, because if anybody had the good fortune to talk to Neil, they probably had to go right to the moon landing because they didn't know how long they were going to get with him. But so I said to Neil, tell me more about Mr. Zint. This was really fascinating. It seemed like it was a formative influence. Neil looked down at the floor. We sat in a study for all of our interviews, and he said to me, "It's not true." I said, "Well, what's not true?" I said, "I got all these clippings." And he said, "Well, Mr. Zint did invite us to his home. He told us how the telescope was built. He wouldn't let any of us touch it or look through it. And when we left that evening, it was a brief evening, I never saw him again. He never saw me again. I never visited his house." And I said, "Well, how could this be?" And I pulled out one clipping from a folder. Mr. Zint, after the Apollo 11 astronauts came back from their mission, in each of their hometowns, there was a big parade. In Wapakoneta, the Bob Hope, the celebrity entertainer from Ohio, the Purdue marching band, Neil had gone to Purdue, the Golden Girls from Purdue, Governor Rhodes from Ohio. It was a huge, big deal. Mr. Zint got his own open convertible for being a notable contribution to, and I said, well, how could this happen, Neil? And he said, well, and he said this literally, he said, "I didn't want to rain on his parade." And the story, I have this story in the book, and it's not to to do any affront to the memory of Mr. Zint, and I have a little story I'll have to tell you in just a second, but early in my research, this showed me with great clarity that I was not going to be able to trust a lot of stuff that I read. That, I needed to go to, if I hadn't asked Neil about Mr. Zint, this goes back to what I'd said earlier about him. If I hadn't asked him specifically about Mr. Zint and these stories, Neil would never have brought it up. He would never have said, you got to go back and clear this up, and I never did this with Mr. Zint. So it was important for me in terms of understanding how important the iconography and the storytelling, the myth of Neil Armstrong was going to be. Obviously what Mr. Zint was doing is he wanted to be part of the history, right? And he became part of Neil Armstrong's history, maybe forevermore, maybe not now in the way that he would have wanted it to be. I was giving a talk early after the book was published. I was doing a book talk for C-SPAN in Dayton at a public library. And my wife was with me on that visit, and after the talk, and I was signing some books, there was a man that was sort of staying in the back of the room, and my wife, could see my wife was talking to him, and she came up to me, she said, there's a man back here that wants to talk to you. And I said, oh, really? That's fine. And so it was Mr. Zint's nephew. Because Mr. Zint was a bachelor, he never had children, but it was his nephew. And he told me how crushing this was for the family. In fact, he told me that, and I think I already knew this, but he said, we donated, and I think in the end they actually got paid for it, the telescope and the structure, roller skates and stovepipe and all, that Mr. Zint had used for that telescope had become the main exhibit in the Auglaize County Museum, because he was considered to be such a crucial personage in Neil's life story. So, I thought it was important to get the truth told about this, not just to show how, the myths could start and perpetuate, but I also thought it was important in terms of if you really want to understand Neil and who he was, and this gets back to something Chris was saying, if you accept the Zint story and then the trajectory of Neil's life story, you have a boy who was fascinated with, he was a dreamer, he was into astronomy, he looked at and talked about the heavens, he looked through telescopes, he was talking to the moon, and talking about the moon and the stars, he was into science fiction literature. All of that makes sense. Makes total sense if you're talking about the first man on the moon. It seems like that would be the trajectory. Problem is, it's not true. It's not Neil's trajectory. And people that were accepting the Zint story were actually making this part and parcel of a trajectory of his life story that was just not the way to understand who Neil was. So I'm going to show you in a bit what a proper trajectory really would be. And starting with this, Neil from the time he was a boy was all about airplanes. Remember, he's born in 1930. This is 3 years after the Lindbergh flight. There's lots of records and famous flights that are being made in the 1930s. In the 1940s, as an early teen, the war takes place. His Boy Scout troop is identifying aircraft types. They've got booklets that have been passed out to them to learn what all the airplane platforms are, what they look like. Neil's an avid model builder. He's begging his mother, Viola, for pennies and nickels that he saves to build models. This is their home in Wapakoneta, and I've got a picture of his brother and sister over to the right. Neil was the oldest of 3 children, and I have to tell, this is the proto-engineer, meaning he was, even as a little boy, he was just, that's the way his makeup was. Neil would take a lot of the models that he built that weren't ones that he thought were necessarily his best made models, and he would put them in a box, and he would take them up to the upstairs bedroom window, and he taught his sister June and his brother Dean, at a little bit older age than what you're seeing in this picture, he'd show them how he wanted them to toss them out the window and have them glide down to the driveway. And Neil would have a bunch of popsicle sticks and a little notebook. And when the airplane glide landed, he would put the popsicle stick in and he would write down which model airplane it was. And then he'd gather them up, he'd take them back upstairs, he'd have them do it again, he kept it in the notebook. He was doing systematic flight training, flight testing, as a 10-year-old. He was a proto-engineer. He was thinking very systematically about how airplanes fly. He wanted to become an aircraft designer. He got his pilot's license on his 16th birthday. He wasn't even interested in driving cars. That came later. I think he didn't drive a car till he was, well into his 17s. But airplanes, he was riding his bicycle out to this grass airfield on the edge of Wapakoneta. He was doing odd jobs to earn money and to just be around the mechanics and the pilots. There were a couple of World War II pilots that were giving lessons, and that's who taught him how to fly. I was lucky enough to interview one of them who is still living that told me about his teaching Neil how to fly. Neil went to Purdue, started in fall of 1947 to become an aircraft designer. So he comes into an aeronautical engineering program. He afforded college because he got a Navy scholarship. There was a naval scholarship program that he benefited from. And 2 years after he finished his second year of college at Purdue, well, the Korean War broke out. And he had to stop his schooling, go to Pensacola, Florida, go through naval aviation training. And here he is. This is my very favorite picture of him. March 2nd, 1950. He's 19 years old. He's made his first carrier landing. This is out in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, look at it. Look at that face. Is he 19 or is he 12? I mean, he's just such a young, fresh-looking guy, and he always was. So the war, he's in there in the war. He flies 78 combat missions. He flies the Panther jet. He's in an all jet fighter squadron, one of the first Navy pilots in fighter squadrons that are flying jet planes. If you've ever seen the movie, and a lot of young people wouldn't have, but there's a movie that was based on a James Michener novella called The Bridges at Toko-Ri. And that's very close to what Neil's experience was in the Korean War. In fact, James Michener spent time on the USS Essex, the carrier that Neil's fighter squadron was on, and was in the wardroom often listening to pilot stories. And so that story, there's actually, I wouldn't say there's a character that's supposed to be Neil, but there are characters that are modeled on people that were in Neil's fighter squadron. So if you've never seen, it's got William Holden and Mickey Rooney and Grace Kelly, and I think, is it Frederick March that plays the captain of the ship? It's a wonderful movie, and it captures Neil's experience. 78 combat missions, one of which involved him having about 6 feet of his port wing sheared off by a cable that the North Koreans had strung across a low valley, and Neil was lucky to get the airplane back far enough south where he could eject and be picked up by an advanced Marine base personnel. So after he does his Korean experience, he goes back to Purdue. And he graduates in 1955, and he's decided not to be an aircraft designer per se. He wants to keep flying. And he's learned that there's a way to be an engineer, that real test piloting is done by engineering research pilots. And he goes to work for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, which becomes the nucleus for NASA when NASA is established in the year after Sputnik in 1950. Sputnik's 1957. October 1st, 1958. So Neil goes to work one day as an NACA employee, and the next day, he comes home as an NACA employee. The next day he goes to work, he's a NASA person. That's what all of them from NACA did. He started actually in Cleveland. He was a test pilot for a few months in Cleveland, basically flying up above Lake Erie into the ice clouds and doing icing research. It sounds like a crazy thing, going up and looking for ice to load down your airplane structure, but that's what they were doing. And then he got a chance to go out to Edwards, where the NACA had their flight research station, because Scott Crossfield, the NACA pilot who was the first to fly Mach 2, was moving on to North American to be the company test pilot for the X-15 program. So when Scotty Crossfield left for his industry position, had left a position open in the NACA that Neil moved into in 1956. So he was out at Edwards, on the civilian side of Edwards, doing lots and lots of test flying. Flew 50 different types of aircraft, 2,400 hours of flying time, a lot of it in jets. And of all the astronauts up through, through quite a few of the classes, he was the only one with any experience flying a rocket. He'd flown the X-1B, and of course he flew the X-15 7 times. And that scene is, flying the X-15 is the first scene in the movie, by the way. So that's what Neil is doing up into the time he decides to become an astronaut. So compare this trajectory with what you have if you buy the Jacob Zint myth. Neil's real trajectory was a boy passionate about airplanes, thinking he might design airplanes himself, a proto-engineer who goes to college in an engineering program, who really first and foremost saw himself always as an engineer, who has a formative military combat experience as a naval aviator. And one thing that doesn't often get mentioned, and I don't know if it's more than coincidence, I address this in the book, but 6 of the 7 Apollo commanders were naval aviators. And that wasn't because there was a bias in favor of naval aviators by the head of the astronaut program, because that was Deke Slayton, who was an Air Force pilot. So I explore the issue of why were the naval aviators, so popular as commanders for the Apollo missions. But that experience obviously was crucial, as was the X-15. Neil, I remember Mike and Buzz Aldrin both telling me that they were part of Class 3, and Neil was Class 2 that was selected in September '62, that Neil that everybody considered him a shoo-in. Neil didn't think that necessarily, but the others, his peers, thought he was pretty much a shoo-in for selection as an astronaut. So that's the real trajectory of his life story, and anything that suggests otherwise is really kind of missing the boat. This is one of the most interesting quotes that I got from Neil, and this, I think, goes to the set of points I just made. I think this is a really, really insightful quotation. In case you can't, you could probably read it yourself, but just in case you can't, I asked him if he thought of himself as an explorer. I mean, all of us would think of him as an explorer. And he said, not so much. What I attended to was the progressive development of flight machinery. My exploration came totally as a byproduct of that. I flew to the moon not so much to get there, but it's part of developing the system that would allow it to happen. I think that's a really important insight into Armstrong. Maybe not the heroic, astronaut as cowboy that we might want, but this is the reality, the true reality. So the first myth, there's lots of myths. I could, if you want to invite me back sometime, I can go through about 15 other myths that there are about Neil. I'm only going to be able to deal with a couple of them, but it is certainly, I think, a myth that Neil was a young stargazer. I'm sorry to the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. It'd be nice to say that he was a fellow telescope lover. I think he became one. He certainly became one over the course of his training as an astronaut and beyond. But that isn't how it started. That isn't what really motivated him. My biography, I think, is largely myth-busting, especially if you're dealing with iconic figures, because there are bound to be stories about them. And I think if you really want to get at the real Neil, you've got to challenge some of these myths. Myth 2, and like I said, I'm not going to get through many myths tonight, but there's this popular notion of the right stuff, which goes back to Tom Wolfe's very good book, published in 1979. I would invariably assign it to my history of flight courses at Auburn, because it's a great read. There's a lot of things to discuss. But I think the right stuff is a kind of a misleading notion. And I think Neil felt that way about it as well. This is a quote from The Right Stuff. And this is the closest that I can come to, if you ask, well, what is the right stuff? And I would ask my students to talk about that and maybe even write an essay as part of their examination. But Wolfe describes it as the ability of a pilot to go up in a hurtling piece of machinery and put his hide on the line, and then have the moxie, the reflexes, the experience, the coolness to pull it back at the last yawning moment and then go up again, even if the series should prove infinite. And I'm not saying that there aren't aspects of that to what a test pilot's life and experience would be. But I think it is misleading. It misleads us into thinking about test pilots in a way that I don't think is very helpful. Of course, they made a nice movie about this. It's one of the most popular movies about space ever. The astronauts hated the movie, honestly. The Mercury astronauts just thought it was a kind of a cartoon caricature, and they especially hated the way Gus Grissom was treated in the film, along with the right stuff, charisma, some degree of arrogance, some occasional coarseness, very competitive. So that was what captured Tom Wolfe's attention, and that's what he molded into the right stuff. Well, in my talks, in my analysis of Armstrong and other test pilots for that matter, I've come to talk about the real right stuff, which I think is something very different from what you get from Tom Wolfe. I've given talks on this, including talks at NASA Armstrong, what used to be NASA Dryden Flight Research Center, where Neil had done his test piloting back in the 50s and 60s. And I'll give you this background. This is a story that I'll tell. When I was, a crucial moment in my conversations with Neil, getting him to finally give me the green light to write the book, came during a day when he asked me to come to his home in Cincinnati. He lived in a suburb of Cincinnati, and to just talk with him for part of the afternoon. Well, I was delighted to do it. I thought this might be a breakthrough moment, but I thought, So I went there and had a very pleasant conversation with him, and in the same room I would eventually do the interviews. And by that time I had done, 4 or 5 books, I think, and I had written a lot about aeronautics and engineering and some about space. And I wasn't strategizing or I wasn't trying to work him in any particular way, but I mentioned to him a man that I had met at Langley who was a Langley test pilot by the name of Jack Reeder, John P. Reeder, who had been an engineer, worked in a wind tunnel, but during World War II, so many pilots were being pulled off for military service that NACA needed to create some test pilots. So that they got some volunteers that they chose from, and they sent them off, and Jack Reeder went to Pensacola to train as a naval aviator. But then he came back and was a test pilot for the NACA and for NASA, an incredible career that lasted into the 1980s. And when I first started working at Langley, I got to know Jack pretty well. He came to my office a lot, and he was sort of semi-retired at that point. And he was an author of, over 100 technical papers, and that was the point where I thought, test pilots, do they write papers? Well, engineering, the real test pilots do. I mean, they're an engineer in the cockpit. They're not there to break records or show their bravado. They're there to learn and to have everyone learn about the man-machine interface. What's going on in the flight. If it's transonic research or supersonic research or whatever, they're learning. It's knowledge that's being hopefully produced. So I learned a lot about the real right stuff from Jack Reeder, not a name that, anybody, unless you're really into the history of test pilots and American aeronautics, you've probably never heard of the guy. Well, the moment I mention Jack Reeder, Neil's face lights up, and he turns to his wife, Carol. This is his second wife. We married in '94, and Carol was in and out during our conversations. He turned to Carol and he said, Jack Reeder was the best test pilot I ever knew. And then he turned back to me and he said, and Chuck Yeager was the worst. Well, that kind of floored me. And that's the harshest thing I ever heard Neil say about anybody. And as I found out and wrote about in the book, he had his reasons to say what he did about Chuck Yeager. But what was really significant, what you latch onto is the second part of that. But what was really important for me and my career and my writing of his biography was the first part of it, when he said Jack Reeder was the best test pilot he ever knew. And I just happened to mention Jack Reeder and how I learned so much from Jack Reeder. Now, if I had said to Neil in that conversation, I just love Chuck Yeager. I really think he's the greatest test pilot ever. I don't think it would have turned out the same way. But I had picked Jack Reeder. And he knew who Jack Reeder was. He probably had met Jack Reeder at some point. And it wasn't like a light bulb went off or had a surge of blood pressure or heartbeat or anything. But I remember leaving and driving back to my hotel that afternoon thinking, this might work out. That was an important thing that, it was accidental, but it was an important thing that I picked somebody that Neil had a lot of respect for. So that's myth number 2. The right stuff, I think, is a false notion. And I'm concerned, I'll admit to you, that there is now in production a new TV series that is going to be produced by Leonardo DiCaprio's production company based on The Right Stuff, that's meant to be like a 6-season thing. They're not just going to do Mercury, which was what The Right Stuff was about, but they plan to do Gemini and Apollo as well, and they're calling it The Right Stuff, and they've asked me to be consultant on the series. Well, it's going to be a challenge for them to, because again, and I don't know whether I should really get involved or not, because I don't like the basic concept, but maybe I can get them to understand what The Right Stuff really should be, not what they think it is. This is a third myth, and I probably just should not even have put this one on. Should have just let Randy take care of this afternoon, because it's, as he knows, and most of you might have an imagination about it, this is a hard thing to explain. But it is, in fact, a myth that Armstrong was preordained to be the commander of the first landing mission. There was nothing preordained about it. I'm going to look at what my next slide is, because I can't remember. Yeah, it's that. It's not what I hoped it could be. I remember being at an event at Ohio State about a year and a half ago. They were bestowing a professorship, a Neil Armstrong professorship in the School of Engineering, and it wasn't going to me, but I was there to give a luncheon talk. And right before me was Congressman Rob Portman from southwestern Ohio, and he was kind of a friend of Neil's, and he had just told the audience at the lunch that Neil had been, in fact, blessed and preordained, that NASA had picked him well in advance to be the lunar landing commander, and it was because Neil was so excellent and so exceptional, and everybody knew that he was the best. And I wanted to tell Congressman Portman that he was full of beans, but I didn't. I just let it go. But I knew. But it's not true. I mean, it really is. It takes and I think this is as far as I'm going to go with it. I'll say some things in general because it would go beyond our time limit. It is a talk really that deserves to be just itself. But Neil became the commander of 11. And 11 became the moon landing, as a series of contingent circumstances. A lot of things happened. I mean, they had a plan. Let me go ahead and maybe move through a couple of these. Actually, my basic point is that it could have been any of the other Apollo commanders. I mean, they weren't picked out. I mean, Deke Slayton, he thought, you pick the best guys for the commanders, and then you put in your crews the best you can from there. And then the commanders and the crews are trained to do the specific mission types. But his idea, and I think NASA's idea generally, was that any of the commanders, if trained with their crews properly, they could all take on just any of the missions. So there wasn't any pre-choice of Armstrong to do the landing. It could have been any of these other guys if the contingent circumstances had been different. We saw a slide from Randy today, which was similar to this. There was a number of different mission types. Owen Maynard, a Canadian who worked for NASA, was very instrumental in thinking through this, along with some others. But there were different mission types. You want to get the A mission done before the B mission, and you're going to move through the G mission, which is the first landing. They actually had types all the way through J. They were looking through what the missions would be like after the first landing. So that was the sequence of things that in theory was going to be planned. And I don't have time to go through this other than to say the crew assignments that Deke Slayton originally puts together, they have to get shifted around for lots of different reasons. And I'll just mention them, kind of in order. There's the Apollo fire that kills Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. Slayton in his memoirs make the comment that Grissom was really his choice. Grissom was one of the original Mercury astronauts, as Slayton himself was, that really he was kind of hoping that Grissom himself could turn out to be the commander of the first landing mission. Of course, Grissom dies in January of '67 along with White and Chaffee. The lunar module is not ready in time for, I think I do have a slide. I'm going to have to run. Yeah, the mission, it's not ready for the D mission. So they have to, the fire sort of puts everything on hold for a while. They have to redesign. They have to rethink things about the command module, about the whole program. And by the time the mission for D is supposed to go, the lunar module isn't ready from Grumman yet. And so there's a man named George Lowe, graduate of Rensselaer Polytechnic, brilliant engineer and space flight manager, who makes this audacious suggestion, well, if we don't have the lunar module ready, let's send a command and service module around the moon on a circumlunar flight. And that's what they did in December of 1968. It was an audacious mission. It was a very dangerous mission, to do this. That was the flight with Borman and Anders and Jim Lovell. But it scrambles the order. Jim McDivitt was supposed to be, his crew was supposed to do Apollo 8, but they were training with the lunar module, and they wanted to do the lunar module mission. So they ended up swapping 8 and 9. They sort of got, reversed the order of those two. So those sorts of things come into it. Again, I'm going through a lot of things here that are going to take longer. The E mission was Apollo 9. That was what McDivitt's group ended up doing, flying the LEM in Earth orbit. 10 was the dress rehearsal, the F mission, commanded by Tom Stafford. We heard a lot of good things about this from Randy today. Other factors changing assignments. Borman, after Apollo 8, resigns. His wife doesn't want him to fly anymore. Borman moves on to other positions. So Borman leaves. Mike Collins is having disc surgery, so that shakes up the rotation. I could go into the details of that, but when his surgery successfully heals, then Deke wants to get Mike back into the crew rotation as quickly as possible. So he comes in on Apollo 11, which bumps Fred Hayes, to Apollo 13, and moves Buzz from command module pilot to lunar module pilot. So there's all these things that happen that weren't planned to be exactly that way. Again, these are details that would take me longer to get through for this. I guess I will tell the one story, because this is original to my research and was not known until my book, because Neil told me, and the only other person who knew the story was Slayton, and he didn't write about it, and he was dead by the time I did the book. Slayton came to Neil during the Apollo 8 flight, of December 68, and told Neil that he was going to command 11, and that if everything went right, that 11 would be the landing. And he said to Neil, if you want Jim Lovell on your crew, we can put him there and take Buzz off the crew. Not everybody wanted Buzz on their crew. Frank Borman flatly had told Slayton he never wanted Buzz assigned to his crew. And this is significant. Neil didn't answer immediately. He asked Deke if he could think it over. He thought it over for a day and a night. And he went back to Deke and he said, and he said it in this order. And the order is significant. He said, no, Jim Lovell, who's on Apollo 8, he's circling the moon during this conversation. Neil says, Jim deserves his own command. If he came on Apollo 13, he'd be lunar module pilot. He deserves his own command. Secondly, Neil said, and I'm working okay with Buzz. It's working out okay. But Neil's first concern was for Jim Lovell and him getting a command. It wasn't for keeping Buzz. Lovell knew nothing about this. When I interviewed him for the book, I told him about it, and he said, I didn't know that. And I said, well, would you prefer to be on, because the ultimate impact of this is kind of significant, because what happens to Lovell, he becomes commander of Apollo 13, which has a problem on the way to the moon, and he doesn't get to land, and he never walks on the moon. Whereas if Neil had said, yes, I want Lovell, Lovell would have been Buzz Aldrin, and it would have been Lovell and Armstrong on the lunar surface, and Buzz, I don't know. You have to be a science fiction author maybe to figure out where would they have put Buzz. They wouldn't have given him a command. I talk to my fellow historians sometimes. Where would Buzz have gone if Neil had turned him away from 11? I don't know. So anyway, long story short, there were all kinds of things happening, and if 8, 9, and 10 hadn't worked out the way they did, 11 might not have been the landing. It could have been 12. Pete Conrad could have been the first man on the moon. It wasn't preordained. It was nothing pre-selected about Armstrong being the first. This is why when Neil, seemingly to some people, overly modest, this is when he was interviewed for 60 Minutes when my book first came out. He did one interview that was related to the book's appearance, and this was it. And when he was asked about, Ed Bradley said something to him, sometimes it just seems to people that you're maybe a little too modest about your role in Apollo 11. And Neil would say, I wasn't chosen to be first. I was just chosen to command that flight. Circumstances put me in that particular role. I just don't deserve it. And there's nothing false in that modesty. He was speaking the reality. This was an engineer giving you, really, it doesn't sound like an engineering answer, but it's an engineering answer. He knew that it wasn't anything particular about him, that any of the other commanders could have done it and would have done it if things had been in a different order. Okay, I'm going to stop with this because it only involves one slide. There's an obvious myth that was around that Neil in later life became a recluse. He wouldn't go out in public. He was kind of like Howard Hughes. And all I have to do is show you this picture. I mean, Neil was a very private man, and there were lots of things that he chose not to do. I have my Armstrong scholarship is sort of coming to an end in the next year or so. Purdue University Press, Neil's alma mater, is publishing 2, maybe 3 volumes of his correspondence that I've edited. I've selected from about 100,000 fan mail letters that have come into him. Not all fan mail, some of it's from fellow astronauts and engineers and famous people, but I have selected a broad spectrum of letters that came into him. And I can tell you, a lot of them are requests, but he got requests like, could you come to Geneva, Switzerland? I'm opening an Apollo car wash, and I'd like you there at the opening ceremonies to cut the ribbon. He got endless requests like that, and 99.95 of the things he's asked to do, the letters that he wrote back are different ways of him saying no, but as politely as they can, sometimes not so politely, because sometimes people just wouldn't let it go. I mean, he got some angry mail from people who thought he should be doing more than he did. But from his own point of view, and I think from mine as well, and it should be from ours, he did quite a bit. I think especially with his second marriage, Carol Armstrong, I think brought out, made Neil a little more open in terms of personality. And Neil did more and more. He did a lot of traveling. He did do more talks. He would not do interviews unless he thought it was something newsworthy that he could contribute to. Like after the Columbia accident, he agreed to give a quote or say a few things to one of the national media. But if people wrote him or called him, somehow finding his phone number, which wasn't easy to find, and wanted him to they have a feature story. They want to do a feature story on Neil, about how his life has been after Apollo 11. There was no chance he was going to do that. He thought that the feature stories were worthless. He thought they would take off in directions that he couldn't control, that wouldn't be true, that might turn into Jacob Zinn stories, so he just wouldn't do them. So, and I think what journalists would then do is they would maybe go back to their editors and say, that Armstrong thing you wanted me to do, he's a recluse and he's not gonna talk to me, So this myth got started that he was a reclusive personality, when in fact, I think he did a lot of stuff. He wasn't as ubiquitous as Buzz Aldrin, thank God. I think Neil was so choosy about what and when he said something that when he did say something, people, hey, Armstrong is saying something. Let's listen to this. If he had been talking all the time, it would have just been noise. So Neil sort of became a victim of his own mystique, I think, and maybe he would have been able to lead a more sane life, and because he was stalked and he had all kinds of things that were unpleasant about his existence, not unlike Charles Lindbergh. See what my last slide is. Oh, guess what? We're back to the start. And at there, I will stop and just say, I find him a subject of endless fascination. I can answer questions about the movie if you have any. I guess I'll just say one thing in advance of that about the film. It's just a small slice of my book. They took a few nuggets from my book to use as the basis for their storytelling. I think it's a brilliant film personally. A lot of people who got to know Neil later on, and some that were astronauts with him, questioned the characterization of Neil in the movie. But I guess my answer to that is the most important interviews I did for the book that gave me the deepest insights into Armstrong and who he was, especially in that period of time after the death of it. He had a daughter that died of a brain tumor right before he became an astronaut. The most important illuminating interviews were his wife Janet, his sister June, his mother Viola, who was dead by that time, but I had lots of her letters and things that she had written about her life and her family and about Neil, and Neil's second wife Carol. 4 women. I got more insights into Neil. I mean, the guys had guy stories to tell, and I listened to them, and they are not unimportant. But, when astronauts would come to me, after the movie and say, that wasn't really the Neil we knew, or someone who knew Neil later on when Neil was in his 60s or 70s at a cocktail party or something, and that's not the Neil I knew. Well, people are complicated. And if you're telling an intensely personal story, which is what the movie chose to do, the person that Neil was with his wives and with his sister, with his family, what he was Neil was a really tightly packed emotional person, and so I think it's significant. I'm not denying that there's the characterization of Neil in the movie is very different from what a lot of people expected and the Neil that they remember. But I think we're all complicated people, and you could think about your own life and think about your friends or your business contacts or whatever, and ask yourself, how well do they really know me and my personal life? And I think and even as a biographer, I don't believe I understand Armstrong or have explained him. Maybe I've explained him 80%. I don't know. And maybe future historians can do more with it. But there are aspects of personality and personal experience that other people don't share in, And the movie was really about that part of Neil that people didn't know. They just didn't know. And it challenges what I call the meta-narrative of the space program. Astronauts as heroes, the right stuff, triumphant success. It was all part of that, but that wasn't the particular story the movie maker was trying to tell. So anyway, I'll stop with that and ask Nicole to come on up. And thank you so much for your attention. I'd be glad to answer questions.
Actually, yeah, you sit here. So thank you for that. That was a great insight into it, because I've always wondered about the myths behind the man. I heard that story. He's a recluse and he never comes out. And I grew up with that. So thank you for that. And also congratulations on the success of your book and being involved with the movie. It's pretty much been a whirlwind for you, I think, the last few years. Oh, is it on?
You're better with microphones than me. I can say it was very exciting, but it was very stressful, because I felt this really awesome responsibility to try to have the movie makers keep it as historically accurate as possible, and I think they actually did do their best with that. I think there's some Al Warden, who was command module pilot for Apollo 15, and Al has said publicly he thinks it's technically the most accurate depiction of spaceflight that he's ever seen in film. Well, I hope there's some element of truth to that.
Yeah, that was, for the people who have seen the movie, I don't know, but
yeah.
It's going off and on. Yes.
Do we have an IT person?
It's full, so I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'll swap with you. So, I mean, all those scenes were like almost gave me a headache, but in a good way, because it was showing the real, flight. The reality of flight, of space flight. It's not this nice bumpy little thing. It was this ridiculously shaking space flight. So the movie was fantastic. And I know I saw you at TIFF talking about it as well with Neil's sons, and they said the same thing. So.
Yeah, they thought the portrayal of their father, and especially their mother, was done they thought it was right on the mark. And I mean, you can't get any better than that. I mean, and so, but I can tell you that in my own experience, this is the first time, that a book of mine was made into a film, and you've got an Academy Award-winning director, Damien Chazelle, you've got Academy Award-winning screenwriter, Josh Singer, you've got Ryan Gosling and Claire Foy as the main actors, you've got an Academy Award-winning cinematographer, so it was pretty, they knew what they were doing. But my own experience is I kind of went through, I started out, very nervous about what was going on. And when I saw, I hate to even admit this, when Josh Singer sent me the first script and wanted comments from me, I sent him back 70 single-spaced pages.
Oh my God.
He would not talk to me for 3 months. I got a call from the executive producer saying, "Jim, what are you thinking? You're paralyzing our screenwriter." And I said, "Well, I'm giving you everything I got. That's my idea. Take it or leave it. You're not my contract doesn't say you've got to do any of these things, but I think you'd rather know them than not know them." But in retrospect, he was still trying to come to terms, and really a movie is the vision of the director. And the screenwriter tries to do what the director, in this case Damien Chazelle, wanted. So Josh in his early scripts was trying to find what would keep Damien Chazelle happy. He wasn't trying to satisfy me. And I probably, in retrospect, should not have sent so much. Because I think, in fact, Josh told me, I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to read it. I'll read it sometime later. But right now, it would mess with my creative juices, which I kind of wonder about that, but anyway, so I was very nervous, and then I went to almost every day of the shoot, and I did what I could to answer questions. And Josh later told me, he said, "You've got a really good batting average in terms of what you're telling us. I think you're batting about 350." And if you're a baseball fan, and you guys must be Blue Jay fans, yeah. 350 is a really good. I'm on the All-Star team at 350. I might be the MVP of the league, but I wasn't sure 350 was that good as the book author. Just making suggestions to the filmmaker. That meant 2 or 3 times they don't really care what I'm doing. But the genesis or the evolution of my own emotions about it was as the movie got made and I got to know everybody better and better, I became invested in the film myself. And so down the road, the movie was well reviewed, but it got some snarky reviews, both from politically, it's a really interesting, the reaction is really interesting. I'm actually still now trying to step back and make sense of the reaction. We got attacked from the political left, and we got attacked from the political right. We got attacked from the political middle. just across the board, there were, reviewers that had problems with the film, although I would say 85% to 90% of the reviews were really outstanding. And so I started to get defensive. I started to be defensive about the movie. And if you go to my Facebook page, I'm posting favorable review after favorable review just because my own experience was from being pretty critical and judgmental to being a little more and more invested to the point where I was getting defensive, and now I'm hoping I'm out of the defensive to let's just take an objective look at this. I take a lot of satisfaction, in fact a person or two has said this to me here, that the movie, although it wasn't an Academy Award, it won 1 Academy Award for special effects, but it wasn't an Academy Award nominee for Best Film. But people have told me they think it's a movie that will sustain itself over the years. And there are a lot of movies that didn't get Academy Awards or nominations, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, for example, that everyone would call a classic, you know, and there's lots of other movies in that same category. So I'm trying not to be defensive anymore. So if I start to get defensive, just start to boo me or something like that.
So let's go back to your book. I mean, you said you pursued him for 2 years to ask him to do this book. One, what were his concerns, and why did you keep at it for so long?
Well, I wrote him a letter. I was teaching a graduate seminar in space history at the time, and I had the best group of grad students at that time in my whole career. And they were encouraged. The first day of a seminar, you go around the room and everybody sort of expresses their research interests. And after the students were done, they came to me and they said, "Well, what do you want to do next?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to do an astronaut biography, but only one that really interests me is Armstrong, you know. But he's so hard. I didn't even know how to write him at that point." And I got from an inside source at NASA, I was given an address that I could reach him, and I wrote him, and I got a letter back. You know, it's like getting a letter from the Archangel Gabriel, you know. And I took the letter into my seminar so they could all see the letter from Neil Armstrong, but it was basically a polite no. And it was, you know, basically he said, "Well, you know, I've had any number of authors approach me. At some point in time, I might agree to do this, but I'm still busy." He had a number of corporate board positions he was still active with. But so he just sort of gave me a polite no. And I knew, and I told the grad students, because they said, "Well, don't give up." And I said, "Well, the worst thing I could do is pester him. I mean, then I really wouldn't have a chance." So I waited. His 70th birthday was coming around on August of 2000. And I sent him a gift box that had 3 of my books in it. One of them that had actually had a lot about the Langley history. And he wrote me back thanking me for the books and telling me and conversing a little bit about one of the books in particular that he had read and had some comments. And at the end of the letter it was, "Well, let's keep the door open." And you would think that maybe it happened really fast after that. It's probably another year and a half before, you know, even after the meeting at his home that I described, and I talked about Jack Reeder, and I thought everything went so well, it was still probably close to 9 months or 10 months before I wanted to keep it simple. So I took an old Smithsonian Press contract, and because I didn't think Neil would want lawyers involved necessarily, so I just rewrote one of my book contracts, and it basically said James Hansen agrees to do this, Neil Armstrong agrees to do that. It was like a page and a quarter long, and I asked him if he would sign it. He may have shown it to his lawyer, I don't know, but I've always suspected that he didn't, because I kept it really simple, and you know, in terms of number of hours of interview, and I went back and looked at that document about 6 months ago, and actually I asked him for a minimum of, I think, 15 hours of interview. Somehow I got 55 hours of interview. So, you know, and I don't think he forgot about the terms of the contract, but things had gone well enough, I think I'd built. For Neil, it was really important to have his confidence. And did I tell you the compliment he gave me at the end of the book? Did I already tell you that? I didn't.
No.
He gave me one compliment, just one compliment. And he said to me, and it was the day of this picture, he said, "Jim, you wrote exactly the book you told me you were going to write." That doesn't sound like much of a compliment, but from Neil Armstrong, someone people had tried to manipulate and tell him one thing and do another, that was the biggest compliment I could have gotten. I'm so proud that he felt that I was honest, you know, completely honest in how I handled the whole thing.
So what, aside from the 2 years that it took you to get him to agree to the book, what were some of the other challenges you had? Because you must have had quite a few. Yeah,
I would say then the next main challenge was, you know, he and Janet had divorced in 1994. And so I'm writing this book in the early 2000s. And Janet had a home in Park City, Utah, which was their second home. It was where they would go for ski trips. And so in the divorce settlement, she got the Park City home, and that's where she was living. And Neil and Janet, like a lot of divorced couples, I suppose, they didn't communicate anymore. And I wanted to talk to Janet because Janet was, she was there through most of his professional life up through they were married 38 years. And I thought her story is crucial. Her story is really crucial to knowing the whole story. She became a historical character himself, so I did ask Neil. I said, "Is it okay if I talk to Janet?" And he said he wasn't sure. He said, "I want to talk to Carol to see if it's okay with her." And so this was after we had got the agreement to do the book. And maybe my next time I was in Cincinnati, he at the beginning of one of our set downs, he said to me, I talked to Carol about it, and if you think you need to talk to Janet, then you should. But I wasn't going to ask them, would you contact her for me? That was not a good idea. So I contacted Janet, and Janet invited me out to Park City, and we just to have dinner together, just for her to get to know me and what I was doing. So we had dinner, and then she put me in contact with her lawyer in San Francisco. And I worked out an arrangement through her lawyer and I won't go into the details of it, but I got an agreement to do 16 hours of interview with her, which has been never put on the public record other than the quotes that are in the book. There were many times in the conversations where Janet said, "Turn your tape recorder off." And so this was a very insightful. Janet had tears in her eyes through a lot of it. Of course, a lot of difficult subjects. Talking about the death of their infant daughter in 1962, the divorce. And I could understand why she was hesitant to have me talk, because on the one hand, on the main hand, why should she share her life story with her ex-husband's biographer? What's in it for her? But it turned out to be, I would not, whatever I had to do to get that done, I would do it again, because I felt, and if you saw the movie, you saw how Claire Foy depicted Janet and what an important, I think, what Claire talked to me a lot about Janet. I did from Janet. Janet died during the shooting of the movie, but Janet gave me the permission to share the tape recordings with Claire, partly so Claire could get, Janet grew up in suburban Chicago, and so there was a particular accent that was not British, that Claire was British, but also Claire wanted deeper insights into Janet, and I feel good that she did such a terrific job playing Janet, and I think the fact that I had those interview transcripts and tape recordings that Claire could draw on, I think they were invaluable in her performance.
Now, there are two different versions of the book.
Three, actually.
Is it three? That's why I was wondering. So what are the differences? Obviously, before he died and after he died, and can you talk about some of the challenges there?
Yeah, and I hope I don't get too critical of my publisher at this point, but the original 2005 book, which was what I use as the cover, is still my favorite book because it's not been edited down in any way. Subsequent editions were. But the problem with the 2005 book is, Neil lives until 2012, and so the last 7 years of his life, he was pretty active in some ways, and so I needed to do a later edition of the book which would cover those last 7 years, what he did, his death, his legacy, and so that's what the new edition in 2018 does. We did put a late 2012 edition out after his death, but that edition just had a new preface, and so there was nothing new. But then the new edition now has the ending of the life story, which is important, and I think there's some really valuable things in there. But the publisher, wanting to keep the book a certain length, insisted on some of the early chapters to be cut down in size. So really, to read the book I want you to read, you need to read the first volume, through the first several chapters, And then then you need to move to the new edition of the book and read the last chapter, because that covers the last years of his life. So, dealing with publishers that are, you wanted to get it to as many people as you can, but when you're dealing with, with commercial presses, they're also thinking about bottom line, and books of certain length are harder they cost more, they're harder to sell. And so, you bite the bullet and agree to do some cutting.
Yeah. So we all have to go out and buy both versions. That's the message.
Both versions. Yeah.
So, talking about Neil himself, did he ever talk, like, you touched on here, especially about his love of flying and, as an engine, like trying to do those test flights while he was young. Did he ever talk about what really inspired him, why he fell in love with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and those were the types of questions that I did ask. But you would think that Neil wasn't the type that waxed philosophical very much. Looking back, he does make some pretty profound statements here and there. So I wouldn't say that he didn't do it, but he did talk to me once. I think Ontario is probably similar to Ohio in some respects. And I know and I grew up in northeastern Indiana, when you're in the cornfields or in the flat fields of Ohio, the sky is so big, You're surrounded by these vast cornfields, and Neil was born, at his grandparents' farm and spent a lot of time as a boy at his grandparents' farm. And of course, Wapakoneta is itself surrounded by farmland. I think there was something about the sky of, the big sky of the American Midwest and lower Ontario maybe, that attracted him to this. Of course, Wapakoneta is only 60 miles north of Dayton. And what happened in Dayton? The Wright brothers were there. And Neil, as a boy, was quite aware of the Wright brothers. And he never, Orville Wright lived into the 1940s. And I don't think Wilbur died of typhus, I think, in 1911. So I don't think Neil ever met Orville. But he certainly knew about the Wright brothers. And for whatever reason, I think it's also in the years after Lindbergh, it wasn't like Neil was the only one who became enthusiastic and passionate about airplanes. I think it was the combination of the passion for airplanes and just who he was, a very cerebral young man who did have this proto-engineering kind of personality about him. He could be very focused. If something interested him, he gave it 100%, 110%. If it was something that wasn't really, and this is a great story I got to tell, it's a short one. We're reviewing the first chapters of the manuscript, and he put little pencil marks out on pages that he thought he needed to talk to me about something. And I had written that when they moved to Wapakoneta, that his grandmother Armstrong, Laura Armstrong, had moved in with his Armstrong family because she had broken a hip or something, and her husband was deceased. And so Grandma Laura came in and lived with them all through Neil's high school years. Well, Neil had a pencil mark there, and he said, "Jim, you got that wrong, because Grandma Laura didn't come to live with us until I left for Purdue, 4 years later." And I said, "Well, you should know, but I think I got this from June, who is Neil's sister." And June gave me lots. I told you about how important her interviews were, and she had the family history down really good. And I said, "I think June told me this story." And he said, "Well, let's call her." So he got on the phone. And June lived in southern Arizona, and of course I could only hear one end of the conversation, but I think I know how it went. And it was, Neil saying, "Jim's here. We're looking over the book. And he says Grandma Laura has, lived with us from the time we moved to Wapakoneta. I was a freshman, and I think he's got that wrong, don't you?" And June says back, "Neil, the reason you don't remember this is that you didn't have to give up your bedroom to Grandmother. It didn't affect you at all, So Grandma Laura was there, but so what does it mean? It means Neil Armstrong for 4 years can't remember that his grandmother is living in the house for 4 years. And I told this story to June, and she said, doesn't surprise me. He just, if it wasn't in his, orbit of what he was interested in, which was airplanes, the Boy Scouts, the band, the marching band, if it wasn't something he was doing, he paid no attention to it whatsoever. And I learned basically that when it came to his family, not only his family as a boy, but his family as an adult, if you wanted information about the family, good luck, because he just didn't, he didn't pay much attention to it. And that's, I think, partly why in the end Janet leaves him, because she lived with that personality, too many years. That's what she told me. She left a note on the kitchen table, said she's divorcing. She just can't live with. And it wasn't because she was tired of Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. It was, I'm tired of a man who won't engage me in the issues I need him to engage me with, Yeah. And I was always surprised when I was writing the book. I always kept rooting, fix this, fix this problem in the marriage. It's not gonna work out well. And and what really amazed me was that Janet stayed with him as long as she did.
I was going to say,
not that he ever. There's no evidence that he ever cheated on her, or there was ever anything like that. Unlike a lot of the other astronauts, but he was just. She said to me in an interview, she said, you couldn't even get an argument with him. That if you wanted an argument with Neil was him saying no. That was the argument. It was over. And when I did my interviews, I talked to Gene Kranz, Mike Collins, I talked to everybody. I said, did you ever see Neil in an argument? And they said, I never thought about that, but no, he didn't argue. He might not have agreed with you, but he just didn't argue with you. And I think actually, and I don't try to do much psychobiography in the book, but Neil's mother was a very devout evangelical Christian. And she wanted her children to grow up that way too. And they talked about Bible passages at dinner and all of that, and made sure the prayers were said. But Neil didn't grow up to be that type of religious person. And I think my own take on it, and this is confirmed by evidence from interviews with the sister and the brother, with Neil to some extent, I think Neil, as a boy, learned a strategy. He loved his mother, but he didn't want to disappoint her, or he wasn't going to fight with her or argue with her about God or religion or anything. So June told me, he said, if Mom was talking to us about religion, Neil would stand there, listen politely, and then walk away. He wouldn't say anything. So I think it was like a mental strategy to deflect and not to get involved with things that he didn't care to get involved with. That's a long answer. Most of my answers are really long answers.
Finally, I'm going to ask, because I know we're going to go to questions, a couple of last things. Because let's talk about the moon landing itself and some of the myths or the things surrounding that. So Neil being chosen to walk out to be the first one, and also the first words.
Yeah. Well, there's ongoing controversy really about both of those items. In terms of him being first out, the question then would be, Armstrong and Aldrin, they land together, who's going to go out first? And maybe people that didn't live through the time or study the history would think, well, of course, it's going to be the commander. He's going to go out first. But in the Gemini program, which preceded Apollo, there was a 2-man spacecraft in Earth orbit, and these were the first spacewalks, the first EVAs. And it wasn't, the commander always stayed in the spacecraft, and it was the other guy that went out. During Gemini 8, Dave Scott was going to do a spacewalk, but they couldn't because they had the emergency in flight and had to come right back home. But coming out of Gemini, one could argue or think that there was a precedent in the space program that if there was going to be an EVA, it would not be done by the commander, because it hadn't been done by the commander before. So when the moon landing it starts to become clear it's going to happen in early 1969, the press gets really interested in who's going to come out first. They want to know who's going to be the first man on the moon. And Deke Slayton really kind of answers the question at the first press conference about this, and Deke says, well, we're going to do a lot of simulations and mock-ups, full-scale mock-ups of the lunar module to see, and the first personnel will be the one that makes most sense technically, to go out. And that in the end is what NASA told people, told the world and told their own astronauts, is that the interior layout of the LEM was such, they didn't need seats for what they were going to do in the LEM. So Neil was standing on the left side and Buzz was on the right side, and the hatch was kind of down in front of them, and it opened, kind of up against Aldrin. And so the answer was, Neil, the commander, is going to have to go out first because it would be too difficult for the lunar module pilot to go out first. And the structure of the LEM is so fragile that in spacesuits you could bump and hit levers and switches and damage the spacecraft. So it needs to be the commander going out first. So that was taken as sort of the truth of the matter for many years. My book tells a different story based on essentially interviews with Chris Kraft and with Bob Gilruth when Gilruth was living before. I was even involved in the Armstrong biography. I did interviews with Gilruth. And their stories are that there was a private meeting between George Low, Chris Kraft, Deke Slayton, and Bob Gilruth, where they talked about this issue of who was going to be out first. And they understood that whoever went out first was going to be another Lindbergh, as they called it. He was going to be world famous. He was going to be an important person forevermore, and it was going to be all kinds of publicity. It could be a difficult situation. They said Neil has no ego. Neil is he's another Lindbergh. He's the right person to do it. Kraft, and even in some recent publicity, Kraft, who's still living, has said there was no way we're going to let Aldrin be in that role. I mean, Aldrin was a very different sort of personality than Neil, and they didn't think it would be good for the agency, good for the country, maybe even good for Buzz to have that role of being first man put on him. Buzz always, when I interviewed Buzz said he really didn't care that much about who was first. There's counter evidence to that. I mean, there are some astronauts say he came into their offices and lobbied, and tried to convince them why he would be better than Neil. He'd be more articulate. He would talk more. All these sorts of things. And Buzz told me when I interviewed him that he just wanted it decided. That it was too much uncertainty, and he was getting questions, and he couldn't answer, and he just needed it to be decided, and that's all he wanted. I don't buy it, because in the documents I found there's a memo from George Low from 1972, and in that Low is recording a meeting. Buzz came in, wanted time with George Low. And Buzz wanted Low to explain to him the decision why Neil was first out. If Buzz didn't care, and he was only interested in the decision being made, why is he talking to George Low 3 years later, wanting to know how the decision was made? I think he cared a lot. And that kind of gets to the issue Randy brought up in his talk this afternoon. There are no really good pictures of Neil on the lunar surface. All of the pictures that you think are Neil, coming down the ladder, saluting the flag, those are all of Buzz. And it's not because, you still get all kinds of wrong answers out there about this. There are people that say, well, Neil had the camera the whole time. The camera was taken off, the Hasselblad German still camera, and Buzz took lots of pictures. When I interviewed Buzz, I asked him, why no pictures of Neil? And he said it just wasn't in the mission plan to do any pictures. And I said, so all the pictures you took were in the mission plan? And he said, no, I took some that weren't in the mission plan. I said, none of them were of Neil. So what you get is a picture. Randy showed him, you have a picture of a part of Neil's backpack, Neil messing around by the mesa, you're watching from behind. And so do I think that Buzz purposefully did not take pictures of Neil? No, I don't think it was purposeful, but I don't think it was in Buzz's personality to think about Neil having pictures taken of Neil. Neil, when I asked him, aren't you disappointed that there aren't any good pictures of you on the lunar surface? And he said, Buzz was just more photogenic than me. Typical Armstrong answer. you know. But I talked to him, you know, I asked this question of Collins, I asked this question of Gene Kranz, the flight director, and I mean, Collins was, when they first saw the first pictures, they were still in lunar quarantine when some of the pictures started coming back, and Mike couldn't believe that Buzz hadn't taken any pictures of Neil, and Mike sort of gave him the brass for that. And Gene Kranz, when I interviewed him, he said, it's a minor tragedy that we don't have pictures, really good still photography pictures of Neil on the surface. What the picture we have now, and Randy showed this afternoon, is there was a film camera in the window on Buzz's side, on the right side of the limb, and what they've done to get a picture of Neil is to freeze frame, you know, one of the best still frames from that film camera and enhance it as best as they can so you can sort of see Neil's face. So that's the best we got of Armstrong on the surface. Take that, you know, you guys can interpret that for yourself. As for the first words, Neil intended on saying, he thought he did say one small step for a man. Nobody heard that. He thought he said that. There's been all kinds of linguistic and acoustical analysis of this, and the experts don't agree. Some say, you know, even though you can't hear it, that you see in the electronic register, if that's the correct, it may not be the correct technical term, but you can see some effort of making a sound that just doesn't come out audible. There's people at the University of Michigan, in some linguistics person, who says that it really was a consequence of Neil's Midwestern accent, in that he said for and a together so quickly. He said for man, like I just said it, and I had the for and the a together, but I'm a Hoosier from that part of close to Ohio, and I can say it that way too. So maybe that explains it. You know, it'll never be resolved definitively, I don't think, and Neil never thought it could be either. But so I asked him, what do you do? He said, well, put the in parentheses. Yeah, another Armstrong answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask the final question, but this has nothing to do with Neil, because you started to tell a story about who was going to be with Neil. Was it going to be Buzz or Lovell, and how he said about Lovell, and you asked Lovell about it, but you never said what he said.
Oh, yeah, I should have. I remember this was in a hotel room in Dayton, Ohio, at the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and I got to interview both Jim and his wife Marilyn. And I remember telling him the story, and I asked him, I think this is what you're asking, I asked him, would you have preferred it for Neil to, if you would have walked on the moon? And Jim's answer, and this is pretty close to verbatim, Jim's answer was, well, I think I ended up where I was supposed to be, you know. And I don't know, I mean, it's another what if. What if Jim Lovell hadn't been commander of Apollo 13? I mean, could another commander have done as good a job in that emergency? I think probably. I don't think, you know, I think probably. But Lovell did an awfully good job. But again, I think, you know, so I think Jim, you know, he was intrigued by the story, you know, and the fact that he had never heard it and Neil had never shared it with him. But, you know, that's a tough call. You know, do you want to be walking on the moon, or do you want to be in a spacecraft where you might not even make it back? I mean, that's essentially. So the ramifications of Neil's decision to say, no, let's stay with Buzz, you know, enormous ramifications, not just for those two people, but potentially for missions success. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to open it up now. Is Randy? Where'd Randy go? Oh, there. So I think we're going to open it up for questions. Yeah, questions. All right. Oh, we have a microphone.
You want them to come to the mic?
If you have a question, come up to the microphone. Yeah.
Don't be shy. As you can tell, I reply to anything. He does great stories.
Oh, it's Randy's story.
Took a shortcut. Jim, thank you so much, and Nicole, thank you as well for this. This is great. I have to ask Jim about your experience with Hollywood and BAFTA, and people should know that during the walkout scene, I showed the walkout scene during my talk today, and Jim is in the walkout scene. He's a NASA guy, sort of looking like this, looking all important. So tell us a little about like Hollywood, the Oscars, and all that stuff.
Well, like I said before, it was really exciting but stressful for me. I marveled, and some people have asked me, if Neil had been alive, what would he have thought of all of it? I think we could have. I talked to Rick Armstrong, his oldest son, who was on set quite a bit. I think Neil would have been fascinated by the technical side of the filmmaking. I mean, the model making. I mean, we didn't use computer graphics for the film for the most part. I mean, it was this huge LED screen, which is like the whole size of the wall here, and then full-scale replicas of the spacecraft of the X-15 were put on a platform on a gimbal and flown with a mouse. And so the actors were actually in the machines in front of this LED screen, which wasn't a green screen or a blue screen or a black screen. It had imagery of whatever you needed, whether it was landing at Edwards or Earth orbit or lunar orbit or whatever. So, so all of the motions that are in the film, I mean, actually, this is not terribly well known, but and when we did the Gemini 8 liftoff scenes, I mean, and there's a number of takes. I was amazed at how many takes, a director would require. I mean, 15, 20 takes on a scene. And Gosling experienced all this himself. One night, he had to be taken to the emergency room. We thought we had given him a concussion, baby shaking syndrome or whatever they call it, because there had been so much motion on that particular day that he was not making sense. Somebody could tell he was like getting a little goofy. And so watching that movie making, Neil would have been fascinated by the technology of the filmmaking itself. Would he have gone to see the movie? I'm not sure he would have ever gone to see the movie. He was not a great film goer, honestly. Originally, Clint Eastwood was going to make the film, and Neil went out and met with Clint. And I remember Neil telling me that he was a little, and it didn't work out, but I remember Neil telling me that he wasn't a huge fan of Eastwood's films because he thought they were too violent, But Neil, I don't know if Neil would have actually gone to see the film. It might have made him uncomfortable. I don't think he would have liked the whole, he knew it was happening when he was still living. In fact, he met with, there were 2 screenplays written before the one for First Man was done, and he met with both of those screenwriters, and he met with, once when I was out in LA with him, we met with executives from Universal Studios. So he knew the film was being made, but he didn't want any, he wasn't going to consult, he wasn't going to be any part of it other than, talking to the people. So I'm not sure that goes far beyond your question.
One quick question, because I know there are people here, but one important thing in the film that I don't know if it's controversial or fictional or whatever is dropping of the Karen's hospital bracelet. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, it's really sort of the culminating scene of the film in a lot of respects. And here's what we know. We know that Neil did go over to that crater, and it was unscheduled. Yeah. And he had to get over there and back in a relative hurry. In fact, there's the cardiac evidence is his heart rate zoomed up into the nearly 180.
Yeah. You can see in the video, he's running to
getting over there. And we don't know what he did when he was over there necessarily. Because there wasn't any camera on him, and again, Buzz wasn't taking any pictures of him. So we don't really know. And we also don't know. There's never been the manifest for his personal property kit, his PPK, where they took personal items. The astronauts were supposed to fill out, a little form saying what all was in them. Neil's PPK manifest has never surfaced. It may be one of the things that's been put in the Purdue archives that's boxed up and is not supposed to be open for a number of years. Possibly it'll be there and we can find out. But even if he had taken something like that, he may not have listed it on his PPK anyway. So the truth of the matter is he did make it. We don't know what he did. We don't know for sure what he took. We don't have any evidence that he did take it, but there's really no absolute evidence that he didn't take something. I asked him. It was one of the very last questions I asked him because I didn't want to spook him with a question like that early on. So I waited till the very end of my time with him, and I said, "Did you take any memory of Karen with you?" And his answer was so classically Armstrong. He said, "I didn't take anything that was personal." So maybe that does answer the question. But I do know, and I've researched and talked about Armstrong for 20 years now. If I got to the Sea of Tranquility, I would go over to the crater. First thing I'd do is go over to the crater and start looking around, because I'm not convinced that he didn't take something. And so is it dramatic license? Could very well be. I have created a quote for this very question. I think if I can remember it, maybe it'll go in Bartlett's under my name at some point. Sometimes the power of poetry triumphs over the ambiguity or the uncertainty of fact. I'll have to get that a little cleaned up.
Thank you, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I understand that John Glenn did not think there should be female astronauts. And I was just wondering if the Mercury 13 or Jerry Cobb ever came up in conversation.
Yeah, it did. And I think Neil felt like that it was a reflection of the time, unfortunately, that women weren't considered. I mean, the criteria that NASA established was such that if you had to be a military, a test pilot or a military pilot to qualify, that excluded women because was the situation in the military at the time. One thing about the Mercury 13, and there are some excellent books on them. Jerry just died within the past few months. They became a part of a program at the Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico. Randall Lovelace was the head of that clinic, a doctor, and he was very interested in comparing the data from how the women would perform, and the women outperformed the men in some key respects. But that program was never an official NASA program. NASA could have made it that, but NASA didn't. So it never was a NASA program per se. And sometimes maybe that's splitting hairs that don't need to be split. But it wasn't like NASA had a program and then they abolished it. They just did not embrace the Lovelace Clinic results and make it part of their program. And I think Neil felt, he felt like it was a reflection of the time, unfortunately, but fortunately times changed. He got to know a number of the women astronauts. He served with Sally Ride on the Challenger Commission, had an immense respect for Sally and for a number of the other, all of the women astronauts. So I think he just felt like, well, that was a time where things just didn't work out like they should have worked out, but we've moved on and we're better for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Of course, thank you, Jim, for bringing back all the memories. I remember back in 1969 watching Walter Cronkite on the black and white TV explaining how to take a picture with a
You look too
camera.
young to remember
I was
this.
born in 57. I started in 65 astronomy. And actually look at the moon with my little refractor. TV, look at the moon. Awesome. The last 30 to 45 seconds when Neil's got the joystick, what's going through his mind? I'm sure did he embellish or explain more what was going through his mind? Did he have something down the site that he wanted to get to as the fuel was going down?
Yeah, well, I did talk, we went through this second by second. I will recommend to you that Neil, there was something that he narrated where they had the film from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, that made the same approach to the Apollo 11 site, and split screen, so the LRO film and the actual film of the landing from the camera. And Neil narrated that, and he did it a couple of different times. He did it in Flagstaff, Arizona, I think for the U.S. Geological Society, and I think he did it one other time. And you can get that on the internet, I think on YouTube, and you can hear him narrate the last couple minutes. And so that would be the best answer for you, is you can get it from the horse's mouth from him. But yeah, I think what I would just say generally is his heart rate goes up pretty high during that stretch, higher than any other lunar landing astronaut. Neil always was a little sensitive about talking about heart rates because they were high during the X-15 program for him too. And he, for the average person, we would think that high heart rates mean anxiety and nervousness. And Neil said that this was actually studied as far as the X-15 pilots were their experience. And he said for him, the peak of his heart rate would come right before, in anticipation of performance. In other words, it wasn't nervousness or anxiety in a negative way, but it was the body and the mind gearing up for what had to be done. Mm-hmm. And so he put that kind of a spin on it, and and so I think when he got to take over, when he realized that the computer was taking them down into a boulder field, and they were long, and he was going to have to start flying that thing in a way that Houston didn't expect, and he wouldn't have done if they weren't going to be long. I think that's when that was real flying. Yeah. I think that's when he really, I think he would have enjoyed it. I think he told me the computer alarms were more distracting than they were, making him nervous about it. Right. The fuel situation, we know a lot more about, as Randy made clear today, we know a lot more about the fuel situation, and maybe wasn't quite as bad as it, but they didn't know exactly. No. But Neil, he was confident, he told me, that he thought he had enough to get to where he needed to go. Okay. So, he, by the time he flew the lunar lander, and he did say that, it was a lot easier to fly the real LM than it was to fly the simulators. And certainly easier than flying the LLTV that he ejected from. Yeah. But he had been in a lot of tight situations as a pilot, mm-hmm. going back into his teenage years. Yeah. And probably most of those guys had been, but Neil certainly had been in some tight spots. And I think he was kind of, I won't say he was necessarily made for the moment, but he was well prepared to fly and to pilot the thing the way that he did.
I'm sure not lapse descent or a few 4-letter words. I'm sure that we know he wouldn't have said, but I'm sure he did. Thanks,
yeah, you bet.
Hi. Something you mentioned at the beginning resonated with me as a younger member of this audience, is that for people of my generation, it was War of the Roses kind of thing. And something I've been thinking about is, as we come to the 75th and the 100th anniversary of Apollo 1, have you given some thought into how, and if you haven't, that's fine, as to how the landscape will change? Because I'm noticing a lot of journalism, a lot of attention, movies coming out about Apollo right around the 50th anniversary. But I imagine it'll be quite different for later.
Yeah, it will be a lot different. For one thing, we won't have any of them left, nobody that was involved with Apollo will be around for the 100th. We had a recent anniversary, 75th anniversary of D-Day, and we had some survivors of D-Day that are still here. My father went in the second day of D-Day. And I lost him when I was 8 years old, and so I never got to talk to him about it. I think one of the reasons I became interested in history was that I lost a father when I did, and I lost a story that I never learned. But yeah, I think when we get to the 100th, right now it would be 100 years ago, is 1919, right? So we had the end of the First World War. Perspectives change. I think historical understanding changes. When you don't have World War II soldiers living anymore, you might very well have, revisionist history, I think, gets kind of a bad name, because when you hear the term revisionist history, it's like, oh, the historians are just making stuff up. They're just writing a new book, and they're making stuff up, and it's political correctness or whatever. I think it's a bad name because, what history does, it's constantly revising because you learn new things. There are new archives. The things we wrote about the Soviet Union and the Soviet space program before the end of the Soviet Union, most of it was really wrong. We had to get into the archives as best as we could after the early 1990s, and we've learned that some of our notions of what was going on in the Soviet space program were totally off base. And so it's important for historians generation after generation to ask new questions, to find new sources if they can, and learn and illuminate history in ways that make sense and have meaning for the generation that's alive today. Like, I think one reason our movie was problematic for some people was I think we challenged what I call the meta-narrative of the Apollo program and the astronauts. It's been told a certain way for a long time, and usually there's some sort of an agenda for why the narratives are told the way that they are. And our movie challenges the narrative. And people that don't want it, the narrative challenge, maybe they're partly responsible for the narrative if they've written books or done movies or whatever. And so they don't. So I think you will continue to. I think historians, as they're trained, are trained to ask challenging questions, not to make stuff up, but to put new insights into history that's always been there. But you don't know enough to ask every question. You learn, and so 100 years from now, I think people won't be so concerned about. I mean, the meta-narrative that has persisted over the Apollo program and the early space program for the last 50 years will probably be long gone by 2069. I think maybe it'll be a new meta-narrative. As a historian, I actually prefer an approach where there's no controlling narrative, that there's different case study insights into things, but they don't all have to fit a pattern. That's some pre-existing pattern that somehow you've got to fit into or you're not accepted. And this gets into some postmodernist, if you're familiar with any postmodernist criticism and stuff like that. They're very critical of the meta-narrative because they think it's actually sort of politically oppressive to have a storyline that's controlling all the storylines. And so I kind of, without being a postmodernist, I'm kind of interested in that kind of an approach to things. And I think without being explicitly methodologically or philosophically oriented toward a postmodernist approach, I think my own work, just because I'm trying to find the truth to a story, I think I've been pretty successful in resisting, just fitting into the pattern that other historians have established.
Thank you.
Yep. Roger, you have a question? 2 quick questions. We have 5 minutes before we go up.
I'll try to keep my answers to 2.5 minutes.
Just a brief question. As you know, there's a new push to go back to the moon and a more seemingly urgent push to get it done in 4 years with all the delays of the SLS. And, I was down at Kennedy Space Center 2 years ago. I saw the tower under construction. As growing up with the Apollo missions that has, changed my life or shaped my life, I love it all. What do you feel do you think it'll really happen? Or do you, we have all this, the history, but it's taken 50 years to get back, to want to go back to the moon. But this time it's for different reasons, obviously. And just wondering if you think it's going to work out. Are we really going back for the right reasons? And what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
Ooh, boy. And you want me to do that? 2.5 minutes. Yeah, we need to have a long conversation about that. I don't think there's much chance it's going to get done by 2024. And I think the announcement to do it by 2024, I think it's going back for the wrong reasons. I'm in favor of going back to the moon, but I want to go back for the right reasons. I think we'll be back on the moon, and I say we, mankind. I mean, one thing that, in our movie caused controversy because we didn't feature the flag planting the way that some people wanted. The flag's all over the movie, let's make that clear. But, nobody seemed to be concerned that we didn't feature the fact that a plaque was on one of the legs of the lunar lander that said, "Become in peace for all mankind." Or the fact that we left a silicon disk on the chip on the moon that had the microscopic engravings of goodwill messages from over 70 world leaders. No one seemed to, or that we left medals in memory of 2 Soviet cosmonauts, Komarov and Gagarin. No one seemed to be concerned that we didn't have that in the movie. It was just we didn't show the American flag in the movie. I would want to go back, and Mike Collins, Mike's been very active in doing interviews for the anniversary, and Mike has been very strong in his statements about how when they went around the world on a world tour after Apollo 11 to so many different countries in so many days, that everybody, wherever they were, what impressed Mike was that people would say, we did it. It wasn't that you Americans did it, it's that we did it. You know, humankind did it. Now, maybe that's just an idealistic, approach, but I would hope that it's not in some sort of a nationalistic sort of thing, that isn't the reason to go back to the moon. There's lots of good scientific and other reasons to do it, and just to be doing it and trumpeting American achievement, and that's not my agenda, and I don't think there's a prayer in the world. It'll be interesting to watch in the elections, but already when the announcement came out of 2024 being the goal, I mean, the Democrats are not going to spend a penny, unfortunately, because of the reasons, the way it's being set up. Democrats are not going to support this as part of the Trump administration, set of goals. I mean, so it's sort of a kiss of death to be suggesting that you do it by 2024 when that would just happen to be the second end of Trump's second term. So I don't think you're going to need a bigger budget than what's been laid out. I think Brandenstein, the NASA administrator, is already stepping back from being able to do it by 2024. I think he's pushing it back, and so yeah, it'll be real interesting to see what really does happen.
You got to pass, because that was going to be my question as well. When are we going back? But thank you very much.
Well, I think we are going back. I think the next voices we hear from the lunar service will be speaking Mandarin. I think the Chinese will do it before anyone else does it. They have a very incrementally systematic program. They don't need to have popular support, for it. The Chinese military basically runs the program, as I understand it, and I think it seems to me that they'll do it.
And there's a final question.
Thank you. So after Neil Armstrong passed away, I saw a statement that his family released saying that in his memory we can look at the moon and wink. My question is that a myth, or was that really? I did it, but why wink? Was it a random?
Yeah, that came from the family. I'm not sure which family members sent that particular message. It was either Carol, the wife, or the sons. You might think, well, why not both of them? There's some hard feelings actually between the sons and the second wife, which maybe I shouldn't have even mentioned, but I don't think they did it together. There's nothing. I think the sentiment is a nice sentiment, wink at the moon, but I think it's kind of a misplaced emphasis, because again, for Neil was about flying. I think about Neil more when I see a plane flying overhead, because I played some rounds of golf with Neil. Whenever a plane would fly overhead, Neil would identify the airplane for me. Neil was still that boy with the model airplanes more than he was winking at the moon. And so I think, it's more in character to remember him in terms of flying than it is to necessarily remember him as the wink to the moon. In fact, he made a couple of points early after his astronaut experience that he would ask the question, when will I be thought of as more than just a spaceman? And so Randy made this point, I think, earlier, today. Neil would talk to you at length if you wanted to talk about aeronautics or aviation with him. If you wanted to bring up the moon landing, you probably weren't going to have much luck. He wasn't that interested in talking about it, honestly.
Thank you. Next time I see a plane, I will wink. Thank you.
Wink at the airplane. That's a nice mix of metaphors.
Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us and shedding some light on not only the movie, your interviews, and your book, but it's been fabulous having you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the audience. Thank you very much.
Are we off the air? Oh, we're off the air. Okay. Now we can ask the real dirty questions, right? Jim, our speakers this weekend have been receiving some stylized prints of astronomical objects, and yours is a lunar eclipse. So thank you very much. Okay, well, we have the room for a while. If you'd like to come up and do some, if you have a book that you want to sign, or if you want to talk to